Oh, excellent. Excellent. Right, now. Now you should be able to. Oh, you can hear me. Excellent. Now I just need to be able to see me. Camera. So. Yep. Heavy distortion, but definite sound. Awesome. Okay, that was a freaking saga. All right, give me 2 seconds. I'll just see if I can deal with the distortion. Sound settings. Device properties. Okay. Still getting any distortion? That's cleaned up now. Excellent. Oh, well, that was a saga. So hello, everyone. I'm sorry for the delay. So I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, Firefox is just refusing to broadcast my microphone. I was having huge problems with it the other day as well. So I had to switch to Chrome, but that's all good. So still a few people here, which is nice. Thank you, Catherine. Yep. All right. Really glad that you all hung around. Thank you. I mean, and I do really appreciate you hanging around and just waiting for me to get this to work. So having no ends of problems. But anyway, yeah. So tonight we are looking at countercuts and counter thrusts and stop hits, and well, they're all kind of thematically the same, but yeah, slightly different techniques. So the basic premise is if your opponent does something that renders them vulnerable, changes guard at an inopportune time, decides to throw an attack without properly forming opposition or properly timing, even if they do something like remiss or throw 2 attacks on the same lunge, or if they faint in a lot of cases, you can hit them with a countercut or a counter thrust, something like that. So anyway, let's get started. So to start off with, just sort of do a very, very quick refresher because I don't know who's new and who's not. And now my microphone has decided to fall off. This is just, yeah, this is really not my night. But yeah, press on as needs must. All right. So to start off with, let's look at the principal guard that we're going to use for fencing and learning defense, which is the medium guard. So as a quick refresher, to get into the medium guard, start with your feet in an L, with a straight line between your heels and the toes of your front foot. So something like this. Step your feet till they're 2 foot widths apart and squat down to the point you can move back and forth without needing to bob your head up and down. The reason we worry about our head bopping up and down has minimal to do with technique and more to do with the fact that the head bopping up and down is a sign of extraneous movement. So when I'm upright like this to move, you notice how my head kind of bobs up and down, whereas if I'm down here, it doesn't because I'm no longer needing to bend my legs to step. I can just step directly, which is a little bit quicker. It's also a bit less telegraphic, which is nice. For our hand, all we do is take our back arm, bend it to 90 degrees, put our fist on our hip. Our front arm bends at 90 degrees with our forearm roughly horizontal, not quite. And our tip should be about as high as our shoulder. So I find a really, really good exercise with this is to look at yourself in a mirror or on a computer screen or something like that. A lot of my guard has actually improved quite a bit since I've started doing these because I can see what I'm doing on my computer. But yeah, the reason you want your tip to be about as high as your shoulder is that means that it's high enough that if you need to, say, counter thrust someone, you can just extend out straight and stab them straight in the face. Conversely, if you see an opening to have a crack at someone's sword arm, and they're in a similar sort of guard, you can just extend out and chop them on the arm. You don't need to, if you're down here, you'd need to raise your tip first, which would give the game away. And if you have your tip up like this, it's actually quite hard to launch a counter thrust or a counter cut because you have to bring your tip down and line it up to do it. So, this is a nice kind of, best of both worlds, really. All right. So now let's look at the basic mechanics of a countercut. So for counter cut, I'm basically working off the assumption that in guard, my opponent gives me a target to take advantage of before they give me a threat. So, they might come at me and raise their hand and raise their hand like this to chop down. Or, they might do a big Moulinet attack when they're way too close. You can do Moulinet stuff, but you need to do it from far enough away that you can't be counter hit. Whereas throwing direct attacks, you can do much closer, which is why I like them. Moulinets obviously have advantages in terms of power, and also they're much better for feinting. But that's a topic for another time. So all I do if I want to take advantage of an attack is extend out, but as I do it, I lean forward a bit to pull the weight off. Basically, I forward weight my foot, so I can also extend my back foot back. So I come to sort of this position. So bang, and you notice that I'm coming forward a little bit. I need a little bit of extra reach, so I can swipe out at someone. But then afterwards, when I come back to stance, I actually take a little retreating step. And the reason for that is that if I miss something, or if my blow doesn't disable my opponent, or if we're doing a friendly sparring match, we're not actually hurting each other, and my opponent doesn't acknowledge the hit, I still want to get the hell out of dodge, because I've had a lot of arguments with people where I'd countercut with just a direct attack, and then they'd smack me in the head and be like, no, it was a double. I'll be like, no, I got you on the way in. But this kind of removes the ambiguity, I guess. So all I do is I extend, I bring my weight forward, my back foot out, and I retreat to guard. So you can do that with different angles. But right now, I want you to just practice extending straight with a cut number 7, and then retreating back. So let's just do that. Let's do that first, just really breaking it down. So break it down into simple movements, and then we're going to sort of do it more smoothly. So start off with extend and forward weight, kicking your back foot out behind you, and then retreating back. And take a step forward so you don't run into your wall. So extend, retreat. Extend, retreat. Extend, retreat. Extend, retreat. Extend, retreat. Extend, retreat. All right. So this is a fairly simple movement. Well, that movement as launch attack, and then launch attack or launch your counter cut and then retreat is fairly straightforward. So let's try and do that a little bit more smoothly, but I might just quickly check for questions. Cool, looks all good. Right, so let's try that all in one single motion. So I'm just going to call counter cut, and I want you to just extend and then retreat in a single motion, and then step back. So counter cut, 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 and counter cut, and step back to guard. All right, so now let's look at the different angles that you would counter cut on. I might, because I notice it's a bit dark, so you might be having trouble seeing me. Much as I really like these gloves, they don't show up very, very well in a lot of the room. I'm going to switch also to my trusty stick. I think there's a little bit of confusion as to what we do because people saw the stick in a lot of the previews. The reason why I use the stick is it's more visible, even though this is cutlass and saber and whatnot. All right. So basically, there are 3 principal cut angles that you'll use. You'll do counter cuts with. The first is cut 1. So I'm just cutting along this line. The second is cut 2, where I'm cutting along this line. That. And third is cut 7, where I'm cutting straight down. I also occasionally do a cut number 4. This seems to be very much a me thing. I don't know anyone else who does counter cuts on that angle. And even then, that's as a riposte. So I'll talk about that when we're talking about, riposting with a counter cut. But right now, let's focus on cutting with those different angles. So same deal. So come on guard, and let's start with cut number 1. So extend, forward weight, and retreat back to get to safety. Let's back forward. So let's do that again. So cut 1, cut 1, cut 1, cut 1, cut 1, cut 1, and cut 1. All right. And you do this basically if your opponent, if your opponent raises a sword, so they can be cut on a 45-degree angle, or sometimes you also do it if your opponent reaches out like this, like they try and come around your guard. Because you get people going, oh, I know what will get around a parry. Like step my arm out like this, and then yeah, you can just throw a quick kind of cut 1 and take their arm off. All right, so next angle is cut 2. I find this one's a bit rarer, but you do this particularly if your opponent comes over to this position, or or if they try and wind around this way. Like again, people will try and wind around your guard with these really, really wide thrusts, and you can't parry them. They're really hard to parry, but they are very, very easy to countercut. So let's just practice that. So cut 2, cut 2, cut 2, cut 2, cut 2, cut 2, and cut 2. All right, and now let's look at the last one, cut number 7. So this is directly vertical. This is probably the one you'll use the most. I find that a lot of people, when they're cutting to your outside or cutting towards their inside, rather than throwing the cut sword in front of them, they have a tendency to do this, where they bring the whole hand over and do basically like a tennis backhand kind of motion. And that's where just dropping the point on and getting the hell out is really, really useful. So same deal. I do is flick out, coming down straight vertically, and retreat. So cut 7, cut 7, cut 7, cut 7, cut 7, cut 7, and cut 7. All right. Then you'll notice that you can use the same, or you can use different cuts for the same counters. So someone going like this, where they raise with their hand, like they raise their hand up to think whilst they come into distance. Cuts 1 and 2 will work really, really well for that. Someone bring their hand over like this in a backhand motion. Cut 7, but also cut 2 will work really, really well for countering this. Someone doing this, cut 1, really, really good. Cut 7 can work as well, but I find that you have to re-angle. So you have to sort of do that, which can be quite good for getting the hell out of the way, but also can take more time, which can ruin your countercut. So yeah, like if you're visualizing this, different cuts for different situations. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call out the numbers 1, 2, or 7, and I want you to do the corresponding countercut. And I'll be miming it as well, so you've got a chance to memorize the angles, but I'm going to call them out at random, just so that you're doing it in response to some kind of stimuli. Obviously, if we're doing this in person, I'd be raising my hand, bringing it out to here or out to here for a different cut, depending on, like just so you've got something to react to, but because, all you've got is me, I'm just going to call it out for the time being. So everybody ready? And cut 7, cut 2, cut 2, cut 7, cut 7, cut 1, cut 1, cut 2, cut 7, cut 2, cut 1, cut 1, cut 1, and cut 1. Cut 7! Sorry, that was a bit too much fun. If you do have any questions, chuck them down in the comments. I do sporadically go up and check, mostly so I've got an excuse to quickly grab a drink, which I'm going to do now. I should have my fancy teacup for tonight. So So yeah, no, if you do have a question, I will get to it. I won't necessarily answer it straight away, but I'll do my best. Another point that I want to cover, and I want to cover kind of separately, now that you've got the basic motion, is how you actually throw cuts, how you generate power, and how you make sure your cut is direct. And that, weirdly enough, is by punching. So there's a tendency, a very instinctual tendency when people get a sword, to make their hand follow the arc of the weapon. So if they're cutting in like a cut number 1 arc, rather what they'll do is they'll move their hand in number 1 arc. And you can kind of see, if you imagine you were standing in front of me and I did this with my sword, you could very easily countercut. This is how people get countercut, is that often they'll move their hand in the same arc of the sword. They'll do this sort of stuff, which of course exposes them. You know, when you're cutting, you want to keep your sword in front of you. And the way you do that, but also ensure that you actually cut and power, is that you punch as you cut. So if I throw a cut number 1, I rock out to this position. In this case, you know, my tips are really far back. I can just leave, you know, I can let my tip stay in place. Although I find with really quick, rapid cuts, it doesn't matter so much, especially if you're standing. If you're lunging, you definitely don't want to let your tip drift back in space or minimize as much as possible. But I just punch out to this position and then bring my hand and then flick my tip forward. So punch and whip, punch and whip, punch and whip, punch and whip. And this is the same for all cuts. So for cut 1, I punch, whip. Cut 2, punch, whip. Cut 7, punch, whip. Punch and whip, punch and whip, punch and whip, punch and whip, punch and whip. All right, and the other thing I'm doing is, if my tip is going to be on one side of my body, so what I'm doing, say cut number 1, my tip is for the most part going to be on my outside line. So I want my hand on my inside line. I want to keep my sword in front of me. If I attack like this, you notice my sword's not in front of me. And if you had your swords, if your sword tip was hitting here, you could very, very easily bring it forward and stab me in the arm. Conversely, if I bring my hand out like this, your sword tip being in the same place, being about here, will now be intercepted by my weapon. So I can knock your sword out of the way as I hit. And that's very important with basic cuts, but it's also really, really good with countercutting as well, because you need to cover yourself as you do a countercut. So let's just practice that. I'm just going to call out the numbers. I'm going to call out numbers, but I'm going to call them randomly. But I'm going to call number, punch, whip. So 1, punch, whip. 7, punch, whip. 2, punch, whip. 7, punch, whip. 1, punch, whip. 7, punch, whip. 2, punch, whip. All right. And 1, punch, whip. 7, punch, whip. 2, punch, whip. 2, punch, whip. 7, punch, whip. All right. So now I want you to try and keep that same motion. I'm going to put a big pause between calling numbers, but I want you to try and do a smooth cut as I call a number. So let's go. 2, 1, 7, 7, 1, 1, 2, 2, 7. All right. Hopefully that little refinement, it's certainly going to help your counter cuts, but it might help your regular cuts as well. So now let's go along and we're going to look at doing this with a bit of context. I'm going to get a shorter weapon to make so I don't smash my roof. This is sort of the perils. It's part of why I put such a big emphasis on cutlass, is just, you know, I can do it with a low ceiling. All right. So I'm now going to do a motion that you would countercut if you were fighting me, but I'm going to call out the cut I want you to do. It looks like we've got a question, so I might quickly pause that. Notice that a lot of your countercuts are rising. Is that because you are thrusting in a situation where a rising cut is possible? So I put that on screen just before I answer it. So this brings up an interesting point. brings up an point. I notice that a lot of your counter cuts are rising. Is that because you are thrusting in the situation where a rising cut is possible? So generally, what my cut generally the cut isn't me coming forward. That's the extension. The cut is me coming down. So when I countercut, I extend to come to the cut position and then drop the tip. So the cut motion is actually that. From here to here is the cut. But to do the cut, I have to come to the cut position. And what I'm doing with that is I notice my opponent's doing a thing. They might be raising their arm like this. From here, as I see them come in, I extend to the cut position so that they're, if you imagine my opponent is raising their arm would now be right in front of my sword, and then I bring my sword down and whip them. But yeah, when I talk about punch and whip, the punch motion is basically moving to the position I'll cut from, and the whip bit is the actual cut. So with like a cut 2, I'm extending to my cut position and then cutting, if that makes sense. And yeah, it's a bit hard to show the angles. It's a bit hard to show. It's a bit hard to show the angles of that you're actually cutting on without having a partner here. But yeah, most of these are descending cuts. Most of the, cut 1 comes downwards, cut 2 comes downwards, and cut 7 comes downwards. There's not really very many situations where you would use a rising cut to countercut. Except as a riposte, and I'll talk about that when we talk about ripostes. All right, so let's make this a bit interactive. So we got a bit off topic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move to one of 3 positions. If I go to here, I want you to throw a cut number 1. If I go to here, I want you to throw a cut. Yourself. Yeah, that would also be a cut number. Sorry. Cut number 1, cut number 2, and cut number 7. So to come straight down. All right, got a quick comment. You did say cut number 4. Yep, I did say cut number 4 earlier, but that is as a riposte. So from here, cut number 1, cut number 2, and cut number 7. So this mimes, 3 different actions you have to deal with. This is when someone tries to thrust around, so they try. Sword tip is sitting like physically here up and down in space, and rather than thrusting against it, what the person does is they try and come around. You've now got a direct line, so you can hit them with a quick cut number 1. From here, they raise like this, and you've got an opportunity to throw just a quick number 2. And they do this, which means you can come straight down on the arm as they come, even as they're coming in with a cut number 7. But I'll call the cut numbers because reversing this in my brain is confusing for me. So I've probably confused you, but let's just do our best. So 1, 2, 7, 1, 2, 7, 1, 2, 7, and 7. 1, 1, 2, 1, 7. Sorry, got to be confused. 7 to here. 2, cut 2, cut 1, cut 7, cut 1, cut 2, cut 2, and cut 7. So yeah, normally I do that with another person. It's a bit easier, but I thought I'd give it a go online, see how it goes. All right. So since people have been asking about it in the comments, let's look at riposting with a countercut. So the times when you riposte with a countercut is when you've got an opponent who throws 2 consecutive cuts, or do what's called a remiss. So your opponent comes in, they throw 1 cut, and then they throw another. The problem with this is it makes you very, very vulnerable to being double hit if you do a remiss, which is why you're not meant to do it. But that's not very, very helpful for people for learning how to deal with a remiss. So I want to actually talk about what to do if someone does it to you, because I've had people remiss at me, and until I learned to deal with it, we just doubled like the dickens because I didn't have any idea. So normally what I do when someone remisses at me is I'll parry, and then I'll throw a rising, usually a rising counter cut. This is the time when I use those rising cuts. Normally I don't use this as a counter cut because it's a slower motion, it's not as direct. And because it's a bigger motion, my opponent might abort their attack or do something weird if they do it as an opener. But if they do it as a remiss, which people tend to do quite fast, bang, and then back works quite well. So we're going to look at that from just two parries, tierce and cart. And let's start with tierce. So I parried tierce. For those who may have missed previous lessons where I've covered this, all I'm doing is bring my hand to the exact same hand position as cut number 2, kicking my elbow in. My sword is out at 45 degrees, so that anything that comes in will run down the sword and hit my hilt. And with a cutlass, my tip is on the center line. With a longer saber, my tip is on the other side of my body to give me as best coverage as I can. All right, so from here, for my medium guard, I go tierce, and then as my opponent remisses, I rotate my tip down, all the way down, counterweight, and retreat. So, tierce, counterweight, retreat. 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 All right, now I'm just going to call tierce, and I want you to do the whole motion in just in one go. So we'll try and make it one smooth, maybe not one smooth movement, but parry and then try and do the counter cut as smoothly as possible. So actually, I'll call tierce and then counter cut just to make it easier because these are two distinct movements. So tierce, counter cut. 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 And tierce, counter cut. Right, so now let's look at the same thing, but on the other side if someone parries cart, or someone comes in on the other side and then tries to remiss around. So from here I go to the parry of cart. So exact same hand position as cut number 1, except my elbow is retracted. I want it bent to a bit above 90 degrees. I don't want it less. If it's less than 90 degrees, my opponent can collapse my arm. If it's more than 90 degrees, they can't. The tip is up, either on the center line, if it's a short weapon like this, or if it's a longer weapon on the other side of my body, so that my sword is in front of me to deal with feints. I don't want to parry like this, where my entire blade is on one side of my body, because that's very, very vulnerable to being feinted. And my sword is up at about 45 degrees, creating a nice sled for anything that comes in to slide down onto my forte. So from here, cart, back weight, and retreat. 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 And cart, back weight, and retreat. All right, so let's try that a little bit more smoothly. So I'm going to call cart, and then I'm going to call counter cut. So cart, counter cut. Cart, counter cut. Cart, counter cut. And cart, counter cut. All right, so that is counter cuts. Just quickly check if there's any questions. None as of yet, which is nifty, means I'm answering stuff well. So just enjoy a nice refreshing tea. This is a chocolate, incidentally, if you're wondering, I'm drinking a chocolate tea from the Tea Centre, which is very, very lovely. So highly recommend the Tea Centre. They're not sponsoring this live stream, but you know, if they want to send me free tea, they're more than welcome. If anyone out there is in the Tea Centre, looks for Tea Centre, I know. All right. So basically, counter thrusts are a bit hard to show solo, but you know, until we're back doing in-person lessons, we'll do the best we can. So for a counter thrust, the motion is the same as a normal thrust, but I really need to make sure that I get stronger position. So actually, what I'm looking for when I do a counter thrust is making 2 points of contact. I want to contact my opponent's sword here, down near the forte, and I want to contact my opponent here with the tip. And when you're doing counter thrusts, you need to aggressively get both. So this is about aggressively coming to a position. And sure, this position is relativistic. I might actually switch to the stick so you can see a bit better. But yeah, it is still an important position to come through. So if I'm in my medium guard and someone throws a big wide, someone throws a big wide cut to the outside, or if I see that they're, what I'm really looking for is that the forte, so you know, the bottom part of their blade, you know, bottom third of the blade at the forte, particularly if the intersection between their hilt and their blade, so this intersection here, is on a particular side of my body. So if I see that their hilt, like their hilt is about here, I can counter thrust here. So I'm moving my hand, I'm basically punching to this position. I need punching to this position, but keeping the tip online the entire time. I don't want to do this where I punch the position and then have to try and bring my tip online in flight. That's really, really hard with any kind of thrust. You want, when you're thrusting, you want to line up your tip first and then extend. But if I'm doing a counter thrust where, you know, I've also got the difficulty of basically having contact with my opponent's blade, I don't want to be fiddling with my tip whilst also having contact with my opponent's blade. So punch out to position and then thrust. And usually this is done on like a little sort of demi lunge. I actually recommend when you train this aggressively coming forward. When you're practicing this obviously guide your blade off, or you know, unless you've got like a really flexible sword or something like that. If you're doing this for realsies, basically the way you do this without minimizing danger to yourself is you'd run your opponent through, like you basically aggressively come in. I usually, as a cue, actually try will thrust, glide, and try and glide my tip off as I aggressively come in. You know, if I can. If not, I'll just, I don't know, just be careful and hope that my levels of contact are enough to stop me from being hit. So for a counter thrust, all you do is counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust. All right, so let's try that as a smooth. This is one movement. This is a single motion, so we want to do this as smoothly as possible. So we're going to counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, and counter thrust. All right, so that's how I counter thrust if my opponent, their sword, or particularly their forte, is on this side of me, is on my outside. If on the other hand they've got their forte to their inside, then I want to counter thrust to the inside. So I bring my hand to the position again, and then come in with a very short, very aggressive step. If you've done my lessons on thrusting, it's basically comparable to extend and then thrust, except this time you're countering. So you notice my hand is a bit wider and a bit closer to my body. The reason being is I want to make sure I've got the coverage. This is also why, you know, the other thing I'm not doing is just extending. Even if I could reach my opponent, I want to sacrifice a bit of reach. So rather than extending, I want to sacrifice a bit of reach for a better angle. And that's why I use this little step to come in. All right, so counter thrusting if my opponent's forte is sort of somewhere around here, and I counter and thrust. Counter, thrust. Counter, thrust. Counter, thrust. and counter thrust. Let's do that as a smoother movement. So counter thrust, counter thrust, counter thrust, and counter thrust. All right, so those are your counters, counter cuts and counter thrusts. Before we finish up for the night, are there any questions? All right, that's looking like a no. There is an added level of complexity that you can do with this as well, where you counter the counter, which is called counter timing. The act of using a counter thrust or a counter cut is referred to as timing your opponent, because you time a hit really well to hit them. And then the counter to that is counter timing. So the idea is basically you do something that causes them to counter thrust or counter cut, and then take advantage. So if I'm fencing and I know my opponent, I've got an opponent who's very, very fond of counter cuts, what I might do is pull my tip up, but I'm also going to slip back. So rather than doing this, which gets me back to here, what I do is I do this, where I'm moving back and slipping, or just back waiting, so they sail by, and then I come straight down on their arm. And when you're doing counter time, you generally want to hit your opponent in their sword arm. You don't want to try and go for the body, because that gives them too much time to recover, and also the fact that you're probably going to be attacking in absence. You're not going to be able to cover yourself properly. It means that you're in a lot of danger doing this. But if you can defend yourself, protect yourself with distance, you're kind of okay. Actually, to explain a little bit more, I think that's a lot of information at once. When I talk about protecting ourselves or covering ourselves on an attack, often, there are different ways to do it. One way to protect yourself on attack is with opposition. So I smother my opponent's sword with mine as I come in, so that they have to reposition their sword before they can throw a direct attack at me. And that's why you keep your hand in front of you, because if your opponent's sword is sitting here in front of you, you're basically making contact and gliding down to hit them. The other thing you can use, but that's not the only thing you can use. There are people who use timing. So George Silver is a big fan of true times and using timing, where basically you make sure that you start your attack in such a way that your opponent is always going to be slower than you, so you're always going to get in first. Which that is a good and worthy thing to work on. I don't think it's as reliable, or to do it reliably, you have to be very, very good. Whereas opposition, you can get started with your opposition is easy to learn, and then you can start bouting with, and once you start bouting, you can work on your timing in a bout context. Top there. The other thing you can use is distance. And so what I do is I basically engineer a situation where I'm in reach of my opponent, but they're not in reach of me. The most common by far way of doing this is by attacking their weapon arm. So if me and my opponent both have equal length weapons, if I extend and hit them on the weapon hand or on the weapon arm, I will be only in reach of them for the slightest of microseconds, which is certainly not enough to hit me. So I can hit and be out of distance, which means I can attack without covering myself. And well, I guess theoretically with decent timing, but I don't have to really worry about it as a way of keeping myself safe. And this is, with something like a knife where you can't form opposition, this is basically what you have to do, is you just have to attack at the weapon arm. And so when I'm counter timing, if I'm doing this to invoke my opponent, haha, you can hit me, and then they miss, they still go something fast. I then have a crack at their sword arm because I'm covering myself with distance, because I can't cover myself with opposition. And so yeah, it's not, unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to train counter timing by yourself, but just envisage, if you imagine situations where your opponent might want to counter cut, like, if you open yourself up, what you can do is, just make an opening and see how your opponent reacts. So if I do this and if I do this and then slip back, just, I'll show a side on, it's a bit hard to see from the front, just shifting your weight, and my opponent lashes out at my arm, I know that at some point in the future, they're going to react the same way again. They're going to go, oh, that's an opening, go for it. So usually what I'll do is I'll throw some very safe cuts, some very covered cuts to kind of, just to keep them on the toes, to kind of so they don't quite realize my ruse, and then maybe like an exchange, after an exchange or two, I'll do this again to try and get them to react, and that's when I'll take advantage, that's when I'll counter time. Alternatively, if you're in a sportive context where you've got a lot more time, a lot more safety to feel your opponent out, counter time, and even if you can like wear a hit or two, just without losing the match, counter timing is great. So yeah, definitely recommend that. All right, so yeah, are there any other questions before we finish up? If not, then we'll start moving on. Right. So we've been trying to organize to specialize after Discord and Discord not working. So we go on Discord and set up a Zoom session, which is not. I should credit to Nick. Nick was doing this, and I'm like, hey Nick, I love the idea of like just going to another platform. Let's do it with Discord. And then that didn't work. We tried that for 2 weeks and it didn't work. So I'm now stealing Nick's idea wholesale and going to Zoom. So yeah, thank you, Nick, for the idea. Cool. The other thing, if you've been enjoying these lessons, so keep coming. We're going to be doing them every week. But also we do have a few overheads. I do have to pay for the streaming software I use, and also also when we're looking to start back up, which we'll hopefully be able to do in about 2 months when I go back to working on campus. Breaking up really bad. Oh, sorry. Okay. Hopefully this is, I think it's when I slump my that rubs against the microphone. But yeah. So anyway, our story is we're gonna be socializing on Zoom after this, and I'll just post a link to everything. So we're going to be catching up on Zoom afterwards, and I'll send you the link to that now. It'll also be an event, and also in the comments. But the other thing as well is if you want to sort of see these continue, you feel like making a donation, you can also donate to us via PayPal, because we do have a few overheads, and also we'll have quite a few overheads when we go to start back up. So we'll do that. I'm just going to finish what I do now, and move this and hopefully this will work out. So thank you for coming, and I'll hopefully see you again next week.